Picture this. You're the president of the United States and you're up for re-election, but the polls aren't looking too good. People are losing confidence in your ability to lead. What is one surefire way that you can ensure you win your re-election campaign? Well, for starters, you could just start a war. Wait a minute, that sounds fucked up. Let me start over. What's up, guys? This is Corey, CEO of History from TikTok. And did you know that no US president has ever lost their re-election campaign during the height of a major war? That can't be true, right? Well, let's go through every wartime president and see if they won their re-election campaigns while the war was still going on. Let's start with the American Revolutionary War. Wait, we can't start with that because there was no president because America wasn't really a thing yet. Let's start with the War of 1812. That was the first major war that the US was involved in as the United States of America. Now, the president during the War of 1812 was James Madison, one of the authors of our Constitution. James Madison was a member of something called the Democratic Republican Party, but it really wasn't called that. That's a historical term to refer to his party. His party was actually called the Republican Party at that time, but it's a different entity from the modern Republican Party. The opposite party from James Madison was the Federalists. They hated Madison, and they hated the War of 1812. In fact, they tried to blame the War of 1812 on James Madison. They even referred to the war as Mr. Madison's War, and they tried to use it as a major campaign issue against Madison to get him to lose his re-election bid in the election of 1812. But it didn't work. James Madison was overwhelmingly re-elected in 1812, and this proves our theory correct, at least at first. He was a wartime president that got re-elected during the height of a major war. So far, our theory is correct. The next major war that the US was involved in would be the Mexican-American War, but we technically can't use this war to help prove this theory correct because it takes place in between two US presidential elections, the election of 1844 and the election of 1848. Now, the president during the Mexican-American War was James K. Polk. Even though James K. Polk is successful with the Mexican-American War, one of his campaign promises was that he only needed one term to be president, and he didn't want to run for a second term. So he kept that promise, didn't run in 1848, so we can't use this war to prove this theory correct. We have to move on to the next war, which would be the American Civil War, which totally proves our theory correct. Abraham Lincoln was president throughout most of the Civil War. In fact, Abraham Lincoln's ascension to the presidency is one of the main catalysts that starts the American Civil War. And he does win re-election during the height of that war in 1864. Now let's move on to the next war. That will be the Spanish-American War, which again, like the Mexican-American War, can't really be used to prove our theory correct because it takes place in between two major elections. William McKinley was president throughout the Spanish-American War, and he does win re-election in 1900. However, the war was already over with, so we can't use this war to prove our theory correct. We got to move on to World War I. World War I is an interesting case because technically the only US presidential election that takes place during World War I is the election of 1916. Woodrow Wilson was president, he runs for re-election, and he does win the election of 1916. So that proves our theory correct, right? He's a wartime president that wins his re-election campaign. Well, not quite, because America was not yet involved in World War I during the election of 1916. In fact, one of Wilson's main campaign slogans was, "He kept us out of the war." So he was actually running on an anti-war platform, which is ironic because he does get us involved in World War I just a year later. But he does win re-election in 1916, so I guess that half proves our theory correct, but we weren't involved in that war at the time, so can't really use that. We got to move on to World War II. Now, the US president during World War II was Franklin D. Roosevelt, and he does win his re-election bid in 1944, which was the height of America's involvement in World War II. Not only does he win his re-election bid, he wins what would have been his third re-election bid. Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected to the presidency 4 times between 1932 and 1944. He won a 4th term in 1944. He dies very early in that 4th term in 1945, but he served over 12 years as president of the United States, which is just insane. This proves that not only will Americans re-elect a wartime president during the height of a major war, they'll re-elect a wartime president that's already been president for 12 years, way longer than any president before him. They really want that steady hand on the ship during these tough times, so the theory holds correct. Then we move on to the Korean War, which, like the Mexican-American War and the Spanish-American War, takes place in between two major US presidential elections. Truman is president during the Korean War, but he does not run for re-election in 1952. So next we go on to the Vietnam War. This is a very interesting case because the Vietnam War takes place over multiple presidential administrations, from Eisenhower all the way to Nixon. So who is the president that we most associate with the Vietnam War? I would argue that president would be Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, Lyndon B. Johnson does run for re-election in 1964 and wins, and this is during the rise of US involvement in Vietnam. However, we can't really use this because was that really a re-election campaign? I mean, technically Johnson was president, running for president in 1964, but he ascended to the presidency because of John F. Kennedy's assassination. So technically that was like his first election campaign for president, not really a re-election campaign. But if you do consider it a re-election campaign, he does win in 1964. So technically that proves our theory correct. However, if you look at the hype of the Vietnam War, which definitely would have been the election of 1968, Lyndon B. Johnson decides not to run for re-election during that year, which was probably a smart move. He was wildly unpopular. The Vietnam War was wildly unpopular. He probably would have lost, but he didn't run. He was eligible to run, but he didn't run, and we will never really know whether or not he would have won the election, although he probably wouldn't have. So then we move on to what would have been the next major war. I guess that would have been like the Persian Gulf War. George H.W. Bush was president. This war also takes place in between two presidential elections. Now, George H.W. Bush actually does go on to lose the election of 1992. So you could argue that this is the first presidential administration that actually proves our theory incorrect. However, the Gulf War was already over with by 1992. And his loss in 1992 didn't really have much to do with the Gulf War. It had more to do with the fact that he rose taxes when he said he wouldn't, and he ran against a more charismatic candidate. So this kind of proves our theory wrong, but it doesn't really prove our theory wrong because, again, the Gulf War wasn't active in 1992. Plus, Bush's son, George W. Bush, who also served as president, definitely proves our theory correct because he wins his re-election campaign in 2004 during not one, but two major wars, the war in Afghanistan and the Iraq War. So the theory seems to be correct. Every U.S. president who runs for re-election during the height of a major war wins their re-election campaign. Now, I know a lot of you are going to say, what about Donald Trump? He ran in 2020, lost his re-election campaign, and technically the Afghanistan war was still ongoing when he lost. So doesn't that prove your theory incorrect? Well, not really, because again, remember, we're looking at presidents who served during the height of major US wars. And I don't think anybody could argue that 2020 was the height of the war in Afghanistan. In fact, Trump and his men had already met with the Taliban and made agreements to pull out of Afghanistan before his administration was even over with. That war was definitely winding down by 2020, so it doesn't really prove our theory incorrect. So what do you guys think? Did I miss any presidents? Did I miss any major wars? Is this theory correct, or can you prove it wrong? Let me know in the comments, and like and subscribe for more content like this.